Antarctica is the only continent on Earth that has never been mined for minerals. But are they there? Of course, yes. Like anywhere else on Earth, there are valuable metals and other resources beneath the surface, but no one has ever managed to get to them. You'd like to say it's all the fault of these endless layers of ice, and that's true. But there's another good reason: the Antarctica Treaty. It is an international agreement that keeps the continent reserved for world, civil, and scientific use. In particular, Article 7 of the Madrid Protocol to the treaty prohibits any activity related to mineral resources with the exception of scientific research south of the 60th South Parallel. And this circle covers the whole of Antarctica. But you know what's interesting? This ban is not a law. Antarctica may be the only continent on which there is no mining, but it is also the only continent on which there is no government and no way to maintain the rule of law. It turns out that Antarctica belongs to no one, so there is no one to govern it. Up to 5,000 people can live there at a time, but none of them live there permanently. And with the onset of harsh winters, the population decreases by half. And who are all these people who come to such a harsh place? These are research station personnel from 32 different countries. There are agreements between countries not to use their bases for military or intelligence purposes. And originally, the continent was a free-for-all. Anyone could come and set up a base here, but as you can imagine, anyone is a bit of an exaggeration. Not any expedition could navigate these treacherous waters, icy, harsh terrain, and incredibly low temperatures. It was only in the 1950s that Antarctica experienced its first real boom in the number of stations and population. However, if there is free land somewhere, then someone will definitely want to make it theirs. And in the case of Antarctica, there were 7 countries that made legal claims to the continent: Norway, Australia, France, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, and Great Britain. But how is it possible if the Antarctica Treaty was signed? After all, this continent must be used in the interests of all mankind. The whole point is that these enterprising 7 countries managed to claim their rights to the land even before the conclusion of the agreement. Terra nullius, or no man's land, is exactly what international law calls territories that do not belong to any state. And since the time of active European colonization, influential countries began to take advantage of their position and appropriate territories as if on a legal level. By the way, even the lands where the Aborigines lived were considered no man's land, and the entire colonization was largely based on the fact that since you don't have a state, we take your land, and now you are part of our country, our culture, and our laws. But with Antarctica, the situation was a little different. Even just getting to it was a real feat, and few countries dared to conquer such harsh territory. Therefore, the rights to Antarctica were claimed mainly by those who made at least some progress in its exploration. While those same 7 countries entered into fierce disputes, 2 very important players intervened: the USA and the USSR. By the 50s, they were already actively present in Antarctica and were expanding their research stations, partly for strategic reasons, partly in order to strengthen their scientific power. And somewhere nearby Japan, Belgium and South Africa were also casting their interested glances. And now 12 countries wanted to take a bite from this icy pie, from which the separation of Antarctica between the states became quite a controversial issue. Just imagine more than 40 meetings it took the countries to come to an agreement, and in December 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was finally presented. By the way, it was signed only 2 years later, and so the countries agreed that the territory is a draw. It is not allowed to fight, build industrial facilities, and extract natural resources. The only thing that can be done there is to conduct scientific research. But what is important is that this agreement does not nullify the country's claims to the land. It only freezes them. So minor disputes about who actually owns this icy kingdom continue to this day. Many countries making claims were not happy about the fact that they actually gave up part of their territory from what could become their future resources or even cities. Some countries, such as Australia or New Zealand, have tried to legitimize their claims through mapping, while others have simply given names. For example, the highest part of the ice sheet in eastern Antarctica is called the Soviet Plateau. Mary Burt Land, part of western Antarctica, is named after the wife of American explorer Richard Burt. But perhaps the most enterprising in land appropriation was Argentina. Its part of Antarctica is officially part of the Argentine province of the Fiery Land. They have built schools and effective colonies there, and the Argentine president flew to the mainland to make a symbolic speech. But there is something in which no other country will ever be able to surpass Argentina in the development of Antarctica. In 1978, the pregnant wife of an Argentine base commander flew in to give birth to the world's first native Antarctican. But as you can imagine, the surest way to assert your claim to the land is to find something of value in it. Geological research in the world's largest unspoiled nature reserve was not only useful for science, but also fueled commercial interest. For example, in the late 50s, New Zealand tried to explore the resources of a piece of land it claimed, but nothing remarkable was found there. It's time to remember the oil crisis of 1973. OPEC countries then boycotted the sale of oil to Western countries, and this further motivated the state to look for other sources of oil supplies. For example, during the 70s, the United States drilled more than 50 wells in Antarctica to find out whether they could provide such supplies from the continent's resources. In the 1980s and 1990s, the research vessels Glomar Challenger and Hakare Maru searched for oil deposits. Here on these tiny but metal-rich hills of Larseman, there are 4 research stations, and on the exposed cliffs of the even more metal-rich Antarctic Peninsula and the southern Scottish Islands, there are 40 stations belonging to 18 different countries. This is more than half of all bases on the continent. Remember that the original international treaty was signed by 12 countries. So today, more than 50 states have already signed up to that agreement, some of them to conduct research, others in an attempt to protect mineral extraction rights. But here a big question arises. Who actually owns the right to profit from the resources found? The one who first found, the one who dug up, or the one who initially said that this was his land? New Zealand mining companies pushed hard for exclusive exploration and mining rights on their own. But smaller countries and non-signatory states urged the major powers to share any potential resource discoveries for the benefit of all. They argued that the resources mined in Antarctica should be used to fight inequality between nations. And in 1988, the Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resources was held in Wellington. What do you think it was about? Yes, even though the countries signed an agreement that they will not extract resources, at the convention they discussed precisely the possibility of mining, how to use the continent in a way that does not harm the environment, and how these revenues will be distributed between mining companies and strange applicants. Representatives of the countries decided that if they were all rubbing their hands in the hope of excavating Antarctica, it would be better to regulate mining rather than try to completely ban it. However, the governments of Australia and France refused to sign the convention, and public opinion leaned more towards peace and conservation of the continent's nature. Instead, in 1998, the Madrid Protocol on Environmental Protection was signed, and it states in black and white that mining in Antarctica is not allowed because it is necessary to protect the ecological balance of the continent. But nowadays, this protocol is increasingly being questioned. Guess why? 500 billion barrels of oil. That's how much Russian researchers have discovered in British Antarctica. That's almost twice the reserves of Saudi Arabia, and more than 14 times what the Americans currently have. At $100 a barrel, the oil reserves under Antarctica could reach $50 trillion. That's an insane amount of money and an insane amount of oil. It's also known that Antarctica has bays of coal in the Transantarctic Mountains, iron in the Prince Charles Mountains, gold and silver reserves, and boron, phosphorus, and uranium reserves in the Larseman Hills. But doesn't such research violate the Madrid Protocol? Actually, no. The Antarctic Treaty states that any activity related to mineral resources except for scientific research is prohibited, and the very fact of finding minerals is included in the definition of scientific research. In addition, the Russian government's 2021 report outlines a plan to observe the geological structures of Antarctica, the thickness of the sedimentary cover, and to create an information base on the mineral potential by 2030. In another report, the goals of the research are stated as geopolitical in nature. Moreover, the same unimaginably large oil field was discovered by the state company Rosgeo. not a private organization. That is, in fact, all the rules are observed. But such a discovery has made a huge resonance in the discussion of the preservation of Antarctica. Do you feel there is a little catch? It is not so important whether there is oil there or not. What is more important is whether it can be used. Ice covers 98% of Antarctica. Only these small areas across the continent are not covered by ice. But the difficulties do not end there. Not only do snowstorms regularly sweep over the continent, icebergs also create an unstable environment for shipping. The ice can be up to 5 kilometers thick in some places, and is moving at a rate of 10 to 20 meters per year in the center, and up to 1,500 meters per year on the coasts. This could damage any potential wells or mines, and therefore lead to oil spills on a huge scale. It also lacks a stable population and labor force, meaning that anyone who comes here to mine must receive high wages. In addition, the ice continent is located more than 3,000 kilometers from Buenos Aires, or more than 4,000 kilometers from Cape Town. And as you understand, delivering goods and people here is another task. You can imagine how much money needs to be invested in building infrastructure in such a place, so that at least something can be mined there. And this is a very important paradox of Antarctica. If the price of oil is too low, no one will produce there because of elementary economic considerations. The cost will simply be too high. If the price of oil does not consistently reach $150 and possibly $200 per barrel, there is no point in even trying to produce oil here. And it turns out that oil production in Antarctica is illegal. The conditions there are harsh. 500 billion barrels were found in the territory claimed by Great Britain, and building infrastructure for oil production will be too expensive. Therefore, it is fair to say that Russia has not discovered reserves worth 500 billion barrels, but deposits worth 500 billion barrels. Ask what is the difference? But the fact is that mineral reserves are what is in the ground. Reserves are what could be used, but we have not yet gotten around to getting these resources. That is, it makes no sense to compare Antarctica's oil fields with Saudi Arabia's oil reserves, because oil under the ice will be much more difficult to extract. Look at this graph of how America's crude oil reserves have changed over time. Did the amount of oil they had suddenly shrink by a fifth in 2020? No, it's just that the price of oil dropped from $70 a barrel to about $40. As a result, that expensive fifth was no longer worth the cost of production. But what happened next? Did their oil reserves suddenly double in a decade and a half? In part, yes, because new technology made it possible to extract shale oil, and that explains the continued growth. But the amount of oil in the ground has not changed. Now we simply do not have the technology or prices that would allow us to extract Antarctic oil on favorable terms. A 1992 study by John Kingston of the U.S. Geological Survey estimated that the volume of oil reserves in Antarctica could be about 19 billion barrels under normal conditions, or 6 billion under difficult extraction conditions. With this calculation of reserves, Antarctica would be between Norway and Qatar, not twice the reserves of Saudi Arabia. Yes, it's still a lot of oil, and it could still be enough incentive for countries to come in and break the treaty. Speaking of which, technically, the Madrid Protocol has no expiration date, but in 2048, any country will be allowed to create a discussion on amending its rules, and by a 3/4 majority vote, they can be amended or even abolished only 24 years away. You will agree that for international affairs, this is not so much, and most likely at the end of 2040, an active discussion of the issue of mining in Antarctica will begin. In 2016, the Rosa Sea area was officially placed under special protection. This is the largest area where commercial fishing is prohibited. So at the moment, countries are still trying to preserve the continent more. But if all these bans were lifted, what would companies and governments actually benefit from these relatively small reserves and high production costs? Did you know that China and India are the world's first and third largest importers of crude oil? Oil provides a significant portion of the electricity and chemical production that has contributed to their rapid growth over the past few decades. Now China has 5 Antarctic research stations, India has 2, Russia has 6, and the United States has 5. And it's positioned that it's all for scientific research, and in these cases it's hard to separate politics from science. The US and China are now in the midst of a trade war, just like China and India. In such an unstable situation, some countries will be willing to pay more to maintain control over raw materials. For example, instead of importing Persian Gulf oil, China may risk paying the price to import its own Antarctic oil. And India, instead of paying for Chilean copper, could invest in its own mine. As the countries of the world trust each other less and less, the Antarctica Treaty is beginning to seem like a relic of the past, and it is possible that in 2048 countries will start drilling the ice, even if economically it will still be unprofitable. Do you think Antarctica will remain inviolable, and how justified is the desire of countries to develop these harsh lands? Write your thoughts in the comments.